So I think we'll make a start now. We've got a fair few people on the call. So welcome to the webinar that we're running this morning, The Exploitative World of Contract Cheating. Thank you for taking the time to spend a couple of hours this morning with us. So just a brief agenda for the session today. So welcome along. There's a few housekeeping points that I'd like to share with you. This is a 2-hour webinar. All of your lines are muted. You can use the Zoom Q&A to submit your questions or comments at any time. And then at the end of the webinar, there'll be some time for Q&A. The recording of this webinar will be available 7 days after the event and will be emailed to you as well. So without further ado, let's get into some introductions as to who's on the panel today. So I'm Deborah Horrocks. I'm a client success manager at Turnitin. I work with academic institutions in the UK to promote academic integrity through the use of innovative technology. And the expert panel on the webinar today, we've got Dr. Irene Glendinning, who's the academic manager for student experience at Coventry University. We have Gareth Crossman, who's the head of policy and communications at QAA. And then we've got Dr. Robin Crockett, who's the University Academic Integrity Lead at the University of Northampton. So welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. To give you a brief overview for today's session, there'll be discussion around the risks to the student arising from unscrupulous essay mills and the subscription model essay mill as well. And we'll explore some of the new ways that company agents are infiltrating student groups and gaining access to campus systems, pressurising students, particularly those who have used their services before. We'll also touch on ways of raising awareness with staff and students and strengthening institutional regulations. And then Gareth Crossman will provide a summary of the new legislation and what that will mean in practical terms, and then highlight some of the work and activity that QAA will be doing following its implementation. And then finally, we'll invite some attendees who have submitted a question to unmute themselves and put their question to the panel. So I hope that's all clear. So let's get straight into it. So Irene, Robin, Gareth, welcome along to the panel. Thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your experience and your insight with us. So Irene and Robin, for you, first of all, a quick question for you. So essay mills and contract cheating services have been described by you as massive, complex and deceptive. Their primary focus is making money, not the welfare of students. They prey on the vulnerability of students who may be unaware of consequences of their use. So can you outline some of the risks and consequences to students, aside from the obvious ones, perhaps some of the more nefarious practices which educators and students may not be aware of?
Right, okay, well, I'll start, and please bear with me. I'm recovering from an horrendous cold, so my voice might fade a bit. In the last couple of years, 2-3 years, I've seen an enormous increase in what you could term whistleblowers from ghostwriters, essay mills, etc., asserting that they've not been paid by the students they're shopping to us. And whether that's, in quotes, a genuine not paying for services received, or, as I suspect in several of the cases, not paying up to blackmail threats, it's not possible to determine, but it's very, very worrying. Just, you know, and as I say, it's an increase in this level of really unscrupulous activity, and I've seen it pick up in the last 2, 3, 4 years.
Irene, what's been your experience?
We've seen an increase in that as well. And as Robin said, it's not clear whether or not the students have not paid up, or But some of these whistleblowing cases have been historical. So they're actually telling us about things that happened some time ago. And some of them have not been essay mills. Some of them have been other ghostwriters that people have used where they've fallen out with them later. But we always follow up on those. We don't always find enough evidence unless they provide it, particularly if they want their identity protected. But we always follow up just in case. So I'm going to focus in on a few other different things that are happening. One of the things that's known from the research that you can talk to students about, because it's really important that you do have conversations with students about this threat, is that the essay mills don't care about students' personal data. There's this complete lack of care. They'll sell the data off to anyone who wants to buy it. And that actually increases the threat of blackmail, because not only is a student potentially going to be blackmailed by the essay mill, but they may be blackmailed by someone else who's got hold of the data. So that's one of the things. Another thing that we used to see occasionally, I've not seen it for a while, I don't know whether Robin has, it'd be interesting to find out whether Robin has, or whether any of you have, is that sometimes ghostwriters and essay mills leave what we call Easter eggs in the work itself, so that anyone who reading the work carefully can spot, actually the student didn't do this themselves. So there's all sorts of things like that that is actually quite a helpful thing for us, but I've not seen that for a little while. But the other kind of thing that students need to be aware of is that this came out from some of the research in Australia, and particularly Kath Ellis and others like Wendy Sutherland Smith, where they've actually looked at the profiles of the ghostwriters working for the essay mills, is that many of these writers are not qualified to university standard. So you may not get the work, the students may not get the work that they think they're going to get to the kind of quality that they want. Some of them are only qualified as far as kind of school leaving standard. And some of them, when they provide CVs, actually fake their qualifications. They produce non-real, as you would expect. So there's lots of threats. In terms of the blackmail, another form of blackmail that we've kind of come across is where a student doesn't want to pay the blackmail, and it could be that it's an essay mill scam, and it's poor quality work that's been provided, and the student doesn't want to hand it in and doesn't want to pay for it. So that might be the reason behind it. But the other kind of blackmail threat is that if a student doesn't want to pay more money, they might be persuaded to become an agent for the essay mill and work within the university to try and recruit more customers for the essay mill. So there are all sorts of things, nefarious things going on there that potentially the student could get caught up in if they resort to using an essay mill.
We've got a couple of questions that seem quite relevant at this particular stage for you, Robin and Irene, about your Easter eggs. So can you give more detail on the kinds of Easter eggs that may deliberately be incorporated?
Well, one I saw was where the ghostwriter had written their name in the text. And this was actually not written by the student, it was written by me, and gave their name. Mm-hmm. And because the student didn't bother to read it before they handed it in, that was left in the submitted work. So it's that kind of thing where where it's very clear what's going on.
Yeah, I've seen things like that in the middle of a paragraph, in the middle of the assignment. It says this was written by X. But the other thing I've seen, it's rather subtler and nastier, is a completely phantom reference, a reference from a completely different academic area shoved in. So it looks absolutely normal. It's cited in the text, it's listed in the end, but why would you have a reference for the French Revolution in a completely unrelated essay on microbiology or whatever it is? And you ask the student and they've got no idea where that reference came from, and generally where any of the others came from.
Thank you for that. So moving on then from the Easter egg scenario, thank you for explaining that. What role do institutions play then in educating students about these risks and consequences?
If I can start on that one, I would say that the role of the institutions is absolutely central. It's really, really very, very important. First of all, you can't assume that students have the same horror about essay mills as we have. I mean, that's come out through all sorts of research, that students don't necessarily have the same disgust that we have about essay mills. Some do, and unfortunately, the majority of students do understand the consequences of using essay mills. So the first thing is to have a conversation with the students and make sure that the students really understand why it's wrong, not just that it's wrong, but why it's wrong and what the consequences to them are. So particularly the threats to them, but also the threats to their education and the complete waste of their money in getting someone else to do the work for them. So that and the unfairness of it, all the kind of justice issues around that. So that conversation is really, really very, very, very important. Also, working with students themselves and working with student organisations is very important. And because often the message will come over better from the students themselves and from the student reps, student unions and so on. So that's one of the areas that's really important. Leadership from the top, making sure that that the institution as a whole understands, and that everyone understands their part in trying to fight this threat. And because it's not just the academic integrity officers, if you have them, that are responsible, it's every member of staff, every member of support staff and so on. And I'll stop there and let Robin come in. I can add a little bit later if necessary.
Yes, certainly support from the top is vital, because as much as people like Irene and myself try and make things filter up from the lower reaches of institutional hierarchies, if you can get support from the top, active, informed support from the top, it is really, really useful. But a slightly different aspect that I've seen is students in their early stages with us or indeed at other universities where I have links, and particularly if they're studying in English as their second or third language, don't pick up on the subtleties. And they Google for support in writing an assignment. They come across essay mill websites which imply in really deceptive terms that it's perfectly legitimate to use their services, and really tangle up the ethics and morality of it. And so you get naive students on occasion using these services in good faith from their point of view. And then they're caught, they're ensnared, and they really need our support, but it's difficult for us to support unless we find out about them. So either from the student themselves coming forward to us, or letting on to their friends who then contact us saying, I've got a friend, can they contact you in confidence because they've been silly, they've done this, and they now realise they shouldn't have done, but they're worried about what happens if they come forwards. What we ultimately want to do is to get all our students studying with integrity and honesty. We're not primarily after disciplining them or expelling them or possibly even taking legal action against them. We want them to study with integrity and gain honest awards. Then they're achieving their potential and we are doing our best by them. Once a student cheats an assignment and gets away with it, then in a sense, we lose as well as they lose. It's a no-win situation, this, that that we all get tangled up in.
I can come back to what I was saying earlier about the being everybody's responsibility within the university.
Yeah.
It's really important that training is provided for staff and that that's updated regularly, so people are aware of the changing threats and the changing nature of what's going on in the contract cheating world. And recently I've been running training we have people called success coaches that work with students in a kind of coaching, mentoring capacity. I've recently run training for them so that when students come to them, and this is a confidential service, it's a kind of one-to-one confidential service. And one of the questions that came up is, can we go with the students into the academic conduct meetings as their supporter? And that's an excellent idea. I think that's absolutely a brilliant idea. So, those are the kinds of things that you can do within your institution. We keep our Students' Union Advice Centre up to date with what's going on, because they are the kind of the go-to independent advisory service. So if a student is being blackmailed and they don't want to incriminate themselves, that is the go-to place first for them, so they can talk to these people in confidence and they get help. But these people need to know how to advise a student. They need to know what to say to them, what they can say to them, what they can't say to them. So having really solid policies and kind of guidance for students is really important. But you can't assume just because you put something in the student guide that will get through to the student, because we all know that students don't read the student guides, majority of them don't. So it's important that you have the kind of active guidance for staff and for students, so that you can signpost students. The guidance is there as backup, but it's the kind of frontline active guidance and support that's really important, and making sure the regulations take into account all the different kinds of things that can happen.
Yeah.
And so we're constantly finding new scams, new ways that students are being targeted and so on. And all of those things need to be in there as guidance and warnings and so on for staff and for students, so that no matter who they go to, they can get the right kind of advice.
And what are your thoughts? I mean, you've said that institutionally you need the support from top down as well, but bottom up is as important with the instructors. Do you think there's a misconception with instructors that this is more work for them, and that if they find suspicious cases, it's going to create more work for them?
Yes, to a point, but despite what I do and what I've been doing for a few years now, I'm still bemused by the number of colleagues who still think that this is the preserve of very wealthy students, that it still costs hundreds to thousands of pounds to commission assignments rather than tens to hundreds. I don't know how to break that myth with people that I can show websites to, and they still go, oh, but it still costs thousands. And I'm kind of jumping up and down, steam coming out of my ears, going, no, look. So there are refusals to accept this as a problem, for a variety of reasons at all levels in I think in all institutions.
I think that's right.
And until I think as individual institutions and the sector as a whole, we accept this is a really big, nasty problem that is basically designed to get students into trouble, to get their money. Because that these organisations do not have the welfare and the well-being of the students at heart. They have their income streams at heart, and that's all they're interested in, and they will do anything to preserve and enhance their income streams. And one quick point, if I may, harking back to something Irene was saying a few minutes ago, is I've seen students who've gone to great lengths to sort of anonymise and obfuscate their identities when commissioning, simply not realise that when they submit a commissioned assignment and it goes through Turnitin or some other similarity detecting software, it's then traceable. All the ghostwriter has to do is get access to that same software and then start to triangulate in on the institution, the course and whatever. And they will probably get to the student ID fairly rapidly just by phishing.
If I can say, it's really important that everyone understands that academic integrity is quite an expensive thing to desire. You know, it requires investment by the institution. It requires work from lots of different people. It requires assigning, you know, appointing specialists like Robin and myself, because I've just discovered my job title has changed. I'm now the institutional lead on academic integrity. Wow, which is what I've been doing for a while, but that wasn't my job title. So I went into my personal details and found that's my job title now. Nobody told me. Anyway, I don't find out things these days. So anyway, but you know, it costs money, and it costs to do it properly. It costs the institution a lot of money, and it costs the individual academic members of staff, the markers, the tutors, the instructors money, in order to follow up on cases and to get the evidence and so on. So there has to be, these people have to be convinced that it's worth it.
Yeah.
That, you know, that in the long term, it will cost less, and it will benefit the university hugely by putting in place that investment. So that's why the work that we're doing, and the work that you know, that people like us are doing, is so important in raising the awareness and convincing people that this is a real problem that needs to be solved and it's worth investing in. So, you know, I think that's really important. So how important is what the university, you know, the institution does? It's really important, but it's important that the universities take it seriously and that they're prepared to put that money and that those resources behind the problem and get it resolved. And nobody has completely solved this problem of the essay mills yet. We don't know the solutions. We're working through lots of new ideas, and certainly in my case, we have introduced about 18 months ago. We introduced an educational way of an educational kind of background to the way that we deal with the cases, so that the students have to have some kind of remedial education if they come through the academic conduct process. But we want to have a course level educational content within every curriculum to make sure that students continue to learn about this throughout the student journey, not just when they arrive, not just in induction, but throughout the student journey, at the right point within the student journey. So they're gradually developing their skills so that they don't need to resort to cheating because they haven't got the skills, for example. You know, so that's very important, that the investment is there behind it, and the understanding and the conviction is there that there is a job to be done and that it's everybody's job to help with it.
Thank you. Looking at some of the approaches that some of these services take, can you describe some of the tactics that can be described as varied and innovative employed by these services to attract the students? So their use of social media, which is heavily used by students, or is of particular concern. But can you expand on this, and in particular, what educators and students should look out for?
Well, I think the most worrying misuse of social media I've seen is paid agents of essay mills basically pretending to be students. And they find the Facebook and other groups that students set up amongst themselves, you know, basically at the time they're enrolling on a course. So they don't know each other yet. So another name appears going, hey, I've just joined your course too. Can I join your social media group? And then they get in there, and then with varying degrees of patience, they just wait until assignments start to get set and you start to get the discussions. And the agent basically says, I used these people and got a grade A or a grade B or, you know, whatever. And you know, that will lure some students in. It will not work on all of them by any means, and certainly several here, as soon as they detect this, start to forward screenshots of WhatsApps to me. I've got quite a folder full. Sometimes you can work out who the actual person is. Sometimes it's more difficult. But it's so, you know, we've got that right from the start, pretty much before they start being taught, before they start attending anything. You know, these people have muscled in on the groups during induction week, and they've got in there, and they're then sleepers until an opportunity presents itself. Even more nastily is I've picked up, I've kind of been aware of it for a while in the background, but just recently I've come across the first direct evidence of it, is students, as soon as they say, I'm off to the University of X on their social media, start to get bombarded by essay mills who pick up on it with various degrees of subtlety. Some are just naked. If you need help, come to us. We'll write your assignments for you for X. They're undetectable, they're plagiarism free, ... But again, others are subtler. If you get stuck during your studies, come to us. We've got expert tutors. We can help. It's not cheating to get help with assignments and everything else. So spinning that superficially acceptable story about the acceptability of third-party tutorial support, if you want, and then a student says, I need some of your third-party tutorial support, and then the costs start to come in and the reality starts to come in, and you know, just depending on the outfit, they might say, okay, we'll provide you with an essay, an assignment, a dissertation for X, or they'll do it more subtly, they'll do it piecewise. So they might actually provide some tutorial support, but then provide a couple of, in quotes, draft chapters for a dissertation, along with the few minute or half hour, whatever it is, online, in quotes, tutorial session. And the student then assembles, you know, what is basically an entirely ghost-written dissertation, but from a series of bits and pieces that are provided over a period.
Yeah, so I've come across very similar things to the ones that Robin has described. And recently, we had an email from a member of staff and a student, quite independently, around about the same time, who had been asked to befriend someone on LinkedIn. And, you know, we thought LinkedIn was quite a safe platform, but, you know, no, it isn't. So, you know, and I went in and had a look, and there are essay mills definitely quite actively recruiting people through LinkedIn, which was a great surprise to me. And because the other common way is that students, the ghostwriters, the essay mills, get access to university systems. We're never quite sure how they do that. One way is that if a student gives the essay mill or the ghostwriter their login details so that they can submit for them, that immediately is a way in. So, you know, so that's one way they get in. Another way is to have agents on campus, where a student enrolls as a student, even though they're working for an essay mill, or they might be recruited by the essay mill once they've enrolled. And then they can give access to the internal system. And in that way, anyone can send, the essay mill can send emails to other people within the university. And we frequently see Chinese essay mills using wildcards. So they'll use a wildcard to try and hit Chinese names. But by doing that, they'll also hit the Chinese staff with Chinese names. And so what I have is a whistleblowing mailbox where I ask people to send any examples they've got from any social media or from email, so that at least we know who is actively trying to recruit students, and we can take action. There was a really interesting email on the disc list, which I know a lot of us subscribed to, asking about whether it's worth taking down and kind of banning, blocking essay mill sites. And Robin and I both answered and gave different answers, so we don't have quite the same view, but I'll let Robin speak for himself. But we tend to block all the ones we come across, and I know there are many that we don't block and that we haven't found and so on. But we also recently we've been having success in cease and desist notices to essay sharing sites, and where we've got our course materials up there. And so we are having some quite interesting success with the legal challenges to these companies, even though they're offshore. So we had one in India recently, and they came straight back and they'd taken stuff down. So it is worth doing that, is following these up, because if nothing else, the staff who report it get quite cross if their material's up there, and if we don't take action. So at least it sends the right message to staff that we are listening to them, and we are taking action when they ask us to. So if for no other reason, I think it's important to follow up any avenue you can to try and block them and remove material and so on.
Yeah, I mean, removing material is a different thing, and I have absolutely, I think, no difference of opinion with Irene about asking, the various sites that are sort of essay banks rather than essay mills to take stuff down that they have absolutely no entitlement to make money from, because that's what they're doing. They're making money out of universities and colleagues' intellectual property. And in principle, I don't have a problem with blocking essay mills, by IP addresses and things from university networks. It's just that it's so easy to get round IP blocks. I don't think it's worth the effort. And we cannot control students' home internet access or even mobile internet access. So even if we do keep an essay mill out of a university system for a few days, few weeks, few months, it's almost certainly having no effect on the students who are, for whatever reason, inclined to follow things up. But we see, I don't think any of us have any data on how effective it is or isn't trying to do this. So if anybody does have some data and would like to share it, I'd be interested in knowing.
I think it just sends a message to anyone that tries to go in through the institution that this is not a safe site. So I think it's important for that. I agree with you, it's not going to stop someone who's determined to use it, but at least it does send that message that you shouldn't be here. I think that's the right thing to do.
Yeah. I noticed in the chat a few minutes ago that somebody mentioned a rather popular piece of software that can be added into Microsoft Word and things. A few years ago, that particular piece of software was being fingered for harvesting stuff that was put through its online version. Whether those allegations...
What was that software, Robin? Can you name it? Because I haven't read that. I didn't spot that one.
It's a grammar checking software.
Okay.
And there were accusations 3-4 years ago online that if you uploaded stuff to the online version, they basically nick your intellectual property. Now, I have absolutely no evidence to indicate that that was ever the case. I stress that. But it does let me make a point that I wanted to make as part of this discussion, is that various services do advertise, not as essay mills, but as third-party plagiarism checkers, grammar checkers, language checkers, assignment checkers, format checkers, ... Basically, third parties advertising that if a student puts their assignment through them, they will give them some sort of report on whether it's well formatted, the grammar is good, a good vocabulary, plagiarism, well, not plagiarism as such, but word for word similarity and all that. There's a big risk to a student if they use one of those. All they're basically doing is handing over their intellectual property to an essay mill or whatever that's sitting behind it, that then goes, oh, that's an interesting way of writing that sort of assignment. Let's get that out to the ghostwriters, you know, and we've got a bit of a competitive advantage for a while.
Yeah, I've heard exactly the same as that. So I've no doubt this has been going on with some of these tools. There's a tool called Viper, which is almost certainly the front end to an essay mill. I don't know whether it's still operating. I've not checked it recently, but I think it is. Deborah, did you have more questions? Because there's some really interesting stuff going on in the chat.
Yes.
You mentioned Quillbot there, which is a whole new area that we've not covered yet, but perhaps we need to pass back to Deborah, because I know you have more questions.
Just a few more questions really around like the student and the essay mill. So if they have second thoughts about using an essay mill, perhaps after they've actually agreed to purchase, can students back out? And can we trust an essay mill to honour students' wishes if they do decide to back out? Well,
interestingly, Robin and I have co-authored a paper recently exactly on this topic with I think Michael Draper was the first author, and Thomas Lancaster and Sandy Dan.
Yes.
So we wrote a paper about this, and we're actually presenting a workshop on this at the Porto conference next month, and we've called it Coming Clean. And so I'll start, and then Robin can pick up on what where I leave it. But essentially, institutional policies should allow for this, in my opinion, and it should be to some advantage to the student to be able to confess what they've done, and to come clean. They will need to face the consequences, because there will have to be consequences. We can't just say, oh, well done, you've admitted it, so everything's all right now. Clearly, there are consequences. But what the institution can do is to actually make it a little bit, make the actual process for the student a little bit easier if they're prepared to be honest about what they've done and tell us about it. And that will give us some more intelligence about what's going on and why, and all of those things as well. So yes, but they need to have a route to do that, and they need to be able to have someone they can go to where they can talk in confidence and get advice about what will happen to them and so on. So that's where these kind of independent advisors come in that I talked about earlier, such as the Students' Union and other people who they can talk to in confidence and be frank with, and get suitable, useful, accurate advice about what will happen. But I think it's in the universities, in the institution's interest to provide a route for students and to publicise it to them. I'm going to hand over to Robin now. There's a lot more we can say about this.
Yeah, I go back to sort of one of my opening points, is that our basic underlying interest in all this is to have students study with integrity and gain honest awards. So if a student comes forward and in some sense says, sorry, I've made a big mistake and it's getting me into trouble, we should be able to support that student. Now, it will depend, from circumstance to circumstance. In theory, if a student comes forward in their first year confessing to having cheated one assignment, we wouldn't be able to let that assignment stand, but we might be able to just let the student repeat that assignment or that module, just depending on the structure of things, and then progress, maybe with a degree of closer supervision than other students. Whereas on the other hand, if a student comes forward in their final year and tells us that they've basically cheated everything that they've submitted up to that point, there is not an awful lot we can actually do, because there'll be all sorts of complexities to do with prerequisited modules and progressions and core modules and things that you just can't unpick. And then, there being enough time and resource, including access to student loans and things, for that student to basically pick up at an early enough point where they were still studying with integrity and go forward again. So there's no one size fits all answer to this. Once you get beyond the point that we should do whatever we can to help and support a student who, to use the phrase, decides to come clean.
And that actually what you've just said there, Robin, actually applies to all historic cases, whether it's a student coming forward or not. If you discover very late in the day that a student has been using an SA mill for a long time throughout their studies, particularly in previous years, you suddenly lose the kind of underpinning. If you start giving zeros for earlier modules, there is no way they can progress. So that's, so it's important that every institution has policies on how to deal with that situation and understands, so that they can be dealt with in a fair but consistent way. But generally, if you find out very late in the day that the student has been systematically cheating, there is no way out for them, which is very sad. But yeah. And that's why it's important that the message is put over very early on, that the students mustn't do this, and these are the reasons why, and these are the consequences if you don't follow the rules.
Yeah, and it's also why it's important to persuade grading tutors, module tutors, etc., that pretty much as soon as they get a suspicion that a student is using an SA mill, to do something about it.
Yes, absolutely.
Because it's in the student's best interests if we can intercept them at that point and get them back onto the straight and narrow, than let them go forwards and maybe clock up a few more, and then they get caught, and then things just can't be unpicked. We end up with no option other than to basically terminate the studies and expel. Yeah. That we really don't want to do that, but sometimes we have no option just because of the circumstances.
But another point relating to this is, if an institution has as the penalty for contract cheating, I know some universities do have this, if the penalty for contract cheating is immediate expulsion, then there is no way forward for a student anyway, and there is no kind of advantage for a student in order to come forward and confess. So certainly what we do is we try to rehabilitate students if we can, if they're found to have been contract cheating, try to get them back on the straight and narrow if there's a way forward for them, but that's not always possible.
Yeah.
So do you think then that in providing this level of pastoral support to students who may be tempted to use the services of an SA mill, that institutions can be seen to be condoning student behaviour?
No, absolutely not. I think quite the opposite. It is this duty of care, it is this pastoral support that we're providing for the student. Because to go back to Robin's initial point, we're not there to punish students. That's not what we want to spend our time on. We want to spend our time on educating the students. And it's the education, and it's more rewarding to educate a student than to punish a student.
Yeah.
So if we can rehabilitate the student, get the student back into our way of thinking, our mindset, and get them to actually start to find out what the causes, what the reasons behind their actions are, and put those things right. So if it's poor academic English or perceived poor academic English, or if it's some other reason why they're resorting to this, put in place the support mechanisms to remove those motivations and get them back on track.
Yeah, I don't see how having a policy that says if we catch a student contract cheating, we will see if we can rehabilitate them, and if we can't, we terminate their studies, could be viewed as condoning contract cheating. The universities who are in practice condoning contract cheating are those who turn a blind eye and don't do anything about it. They're the ones the students should be wary of, because
Absolutely.
if they go there and if they make a mistake, then they're not going to get any support.
Yeah. So just looking in the Q&A box, there's a question that's popped up that I'm keen to get your thoughts on. So do you have any thoughts and or advice on managing the complexities of anonymous marking and contract cheating, particularly around closer supervision of a student who has been caught or admitted cheating previously?
Well, it doesn't work with anonymous marking, does it? Really, that's the problem, because certainly if you're using authorship, the whole point of authorship is that you look at the profile of the student work and you have a look at the what the student has done before, and you look for similarities and differences in what the student has been doing, and other markers, of course. But I would advise, not having anonymous marking where there's a risk of contract cheating. We fortunately we don't have anonymous marking in most of our kind of coursework modules. We do in exams, but not in the coursework. But interestingly, I'm not sure what they've been doing with the move to online, whether they, because everything goes through Turnitin now, even if it's an online exam, that's submitted through Turnitin, and that's been throwing up an awful lot of collusion during the exams, and some of which might be through third parties like Course Hero and Shade and so on. But submitting through Turnitin and having that and having the ability to compare students' work has thrown up lots and lots of, shall we say, inappropriate collaboration during the exams where they're sharing answers and so on. And so that, I mean, we've not talked about course design, have we, at all? But the idea of the kind of assessment design, you can't design out cheating. We know that now, but you can make it harder. So the attention to detail and care, particularly with online exams, with how you set them, and not to ask students to just produce factual answers and so on, is just so it's so important. It's extra work for everybody, but then so is dealing with the cheating afterwards. So it's much better to set a piece of assessment that makes it harder, the students to cheat.
Yes, yeah. I mean, given the range of services that SA Mills and other companies with SA Mill functions now offer, from those that students subscribe to, getting solutions to problems to them within 10-20 minutes or so, to things at the other end where if a student keeps the SA Mill in the loop during the progression of their dissertation, for example, so a period of several months, they then get a sort of tailor-made ghost-written dissertation that takes into account formative feedback from sort of proposals and presentations made during the course of the development of the dissertation. It is not possible to design out contract cheating. But the more tutors can tailor assignments to what they actually teach and the students' actual experiences on the course, the trick it becomes. And sometimes, the easier it becomes to pick up an assignment that was written by somebody who was doing a different course somewhere else, rather than the one the tutor has set the assignment on. And that really is, I think, the best we can do in the current climate, is just to make it as difficult as we can. Because the other side of that is that difficult equals expensive. A stock assignment that could be the same as set at countless other universities, and not just in the English-speaking world, but in other languages, is ever so cheap to ghostwrite. An assignment that is tailored to a course at a university and to a set of lecture and seminar and tutorial experiences is more expensive to provide. And cost can be a deterrent, although prices are so ridiculously low at the moment, not much of a deterrent.
Well, when you consider how much they pay for their fees in the first place,
yeah,
it's a fraction of what they're paying for.
Yes, yeah.
Can you give an example of the price range for using these services? I did see that as a question earlier.
Yeah, I mean, for us, for our typical undergraduate final year dissertation, it's 2 modules. So it's a third of their final year. So in approximate terms, it's a third of just over 9K in terms of the fees. A student can go out and commission that dissertation for anything sort of £500 upwards, depending on subject and depending on what they want to do. So as Irene says, it's a fraction of the fees that we charge them. But yeah, tech assignments that can be done in countries in Africa with lower cost of living, countries in the India and Pakistan and Vietnam and things, and other Southeast Asian countries where the cost of living is a fraction of what it is in the UK, in the EU and the US. The lowest I've seen is £25. And that wasn't for a first year assignment.
Oh dear.
Yeah. So the cost is not a barrier.
Yeah.
The cost is not. That's the message, really.
Yeah. And even more recently than that, the costs for humanities assignments have been coming down quite dramatically as well, as there seems to be an increasing body of people who've got good qualifications in, broadly speaking, arts and humanities subjects, who are underemployed and under-awarded in their own countries, can write in English.
That's interesting. Stephen Bailey's just put $11.50 for a check for a month.
Yeah, so about £8.50. So pocket money level monthly subscription to Chegg, just to pick up on Steve's point.
Yeah.
So just for the purposes of time, Robin and Irene will come back to you at the end, because we'll have some more questions for you to ask live. But I think now is a good time to hand over to Gareth, so that Gareth can give us an update on the legislative side of things and the work that QAA have been doing. So Gareth, over to you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I'll share my screen in a moment. I'm going to give a presentation with some slides. I'll try and brush over the bits where there's already been extensive discussion. It would be a bit of a concern if there wasn't any commonality between what I'm presenting on and what we've just been discussing. But I'll do what I can to avoid going into too much detail in those areas. Hopefully this is now shared.
Yeah, we can see.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking about as somebody said in the chat earlier, there is legislation about to be introduced in England. And I'm going to talk in a bit of detail about what that actually means, what some of the implications are, and then I'll just talk more generally about some of the work that we are doing, and just remind of some of the resources that we have available for you. Again, a lot of what we've been talking about is covered in that, so I probably won't spend a huge amount of time on those areas. But probably don't need to spend too long on this slide. I'm actually on the BBC News piece there, that's actually quite old. I think that's 2018, that piece of research from Professor Philip Newton at Swansea University, which indicated that about 1 in 7 were paying for essay mills. By definition, it's, as Phil Newton made clear at the time. I think what is more indicative of the market is to look at it from a buyer's market perspective. And if you look at essay mill comparison sites like UK Top Writers, there are others. They currently, as yesterday, they were listing 1,070 sites. That's very conservative. The Texer estimate there are probably in the region of 3,000 globally, all of whom presumably are turning some sort of profit. So that gives an indication of the scale. So the good news, well, the good news if you're in England anyway, the good news is that clauses were added to the Skills and Post-16 Education Act. I've said it's Act. It's actually technically still a bill, because even though it's finished through Parliament, it hasn't yet received royal assent. That's going to be after Easter. But I called it an act now because essentially it is an act of Parliament just waiting for royal assent. What will this do? It will make it an offence for a person to provide or arrange for someone else to provide a relevant service to students for a relative assignment in commercial circumstances. I'll give a bit more detail on those definitions in a moment. It will also make it an offence to advertise a relevant service, and it defines a person to cover the actions of a company, with the officers of the company personally also personally liable for its actions. So just some of the definitions there. Relevant service means completing all or part of an assessment where the assessment could not reasonably be considered to have been completed by the student. And a relevant assessment is one that is part of a course leading to any form of post-16 qualification. Just going to pause there and stop on the post-16 elements. Earlier drafts of this bill, and we worked very closely with the DFE in developing this. Earlier drafts of the bill made it HE only. We were trying to see if we could get it extended to secondary education, and certainly the members of the Irene and Robin, both members of the Academic Integrity Advisory Group, we had some conversations about this. But even if secondary education was considered to be pushing it a bit far, the reason why it was so important that it covers post-16 is that you could end up with anomalous situations where, say, in an FE college offering HE, you had 2 students who were doing similar sort of courses, using exactly the same essay mill, writing similar piece of work, and one would be covered by the legislation and the other wouldn't. So we said this would be an anomalous situation, which fortunately has been resolved by the DFE agreeing it should be any form of post-16 qualification. And a student is defined as anyone in post-16 education. So there's no upper limit there. Assessment is defined to include examinations. I've said this is important. I probably don't need to go into detail why, considering the conversations that we've just had. And commercial circumstances is where a person is acting in the course of a business and includes both the business and the assessment writer, although I think we can expect that any focus in terms of action under the new legislation will be on the business rather than an individual writer. Now, this bit is really important. It is a strict liability offence, and a strict liability offence essentially is one where you don't need to prove intent. Now, proving intent in criminal cases is a kind of cornerstone of criminal justice system, and it's very rare for parliaments, for the UK Parliament certainly, to pass legislation that does not include the need for intent. It does happen. If you drink drive, it doesn't matter what your intention was. If you're over the limit, you've committed the offence, but it is rare. But it was also really important that it was a strict liability offence because of disclaimers. So we know all over, any essay mill site, don't, for heaven forfend, submit this as your own work. So when you apply that to when you apply disclaimers to the criminal standard of proof of beyond reasonable doubt, it would have made it very, very difficult to to introduce effective legislation. The experience in New Zealand when that was introduced, and one of the first jurisdictions to do so, made it's basically not been used. There is a due diligence defence, which is based on some work by Professor Michael Draper from Swansea University, which says that the defendant, if they couldn't have known, if they didn't know or couldn't with reasonable diligence have known that the students would use the material provided to complete the assessment, then they can use that as a defence. But importantly, they can't just point to their disclaimer in order to establish the defence. So lingered a bit on that, but one of the reasons why it was so important to have this as a strict liability, or strictly a limited strict liability offence. So just a few things to note. Unlike in Australia and Ireland, who have also introduced legislation, these are freestanding offences. They are not tied to regulator. So TEXA in Australia and QQ in Ireland, they're statutory bodies who have these the offences added to their armoury of statutory action. This is not the case in England. It would be a matter for the police and the CPS to decide whether to prosecute. Talk about a bit more about that in a moment. The need for commercial circumstances means that, for example, family members and friends who help with assignments won't be covered. I just going to stress there, it's still academic misconduct, but we're talking about whether or not this falls into the realm of criminality. Nor would students paying each other for work, unless really someone had a little bit of a cottage industry going on, which then could fall within the definition of commercial purposes. The requirement that the work could not reasonably be considered to be the student's means that tuition services should not be covered. And I've underlined should there because, we are aware of some companies who it has been suggested have knowingly had students commit to complete exams in real time using those services. So that may well fall in that I wouldn't say would fall outside the definition, but certainly that grey area between where does tuition actually become active help, certainly that shouldn't be covered by the legislation. The advertising offence means you don't actually need to have provided an assignment, which is very helpful. And as I mentioned, it relates to English institutions, but it also would apply to any essay mills based in Wales that are used by students at an English institution. Again, I'll just mention a bit more about that at the end. So what does this all mean? We've been campaigning to try and get rid of essay mills since about 2017. When I say get rid of essay mills, sorry, that's slightly aspirational, to criminalise essay mills, because essay mills will carry on operating. Many of them are based around outside the UK, wouldn't be covered anyway. In any event, there are unlikely to be many prosecutions. The real impact is going to be in two areas. Firstly, in relation to the ability of essay mills to market and advertise their services. QAA wrote to a range of online provider, Google, Yahoo, Bing, Facebook, I was about to say Turnitin, sorry, Facebook, LinkedIn and YouTube, I think it was, to say back in 2018 or 19 saying, these are immoral companies, they are making money out of academic misconduct. Please don't take paid for advertising. But we basically had to rely on their ethical code, and with limited success. We are now going to revisit this because they will now be accepting money from criminal entities, whether or not they're based in the UK and whether or not they are actually prosecuted because they are, because of the legislature, they would be covered by the legislation. Worth noting, TEXA in Australia have just successfully applied for an injunction to block essay mill sites, and JISC have said that once the legislation is enforced, they'll be able to block sites via the Janet system. And then I said there were two elements. The second element, this sends out a really important message to students. It's one of those soft areas, but this is what TEXA have said since the introduction of their legislation. It's really changed the dynamic they can have with institutions, and by extension, institutions can have with their students, because you can now tell your students, engage with these companies, you are engaging with criminal entities. We talks a fair bit at the beginning about blackmail. Also worth mentioning, because I think I took out a slide which mentioned this, but this is some essay mills, you're getting into some quite murky waters. We got contacted by TEXA last year, who said that essay mills were embedding themselves in Australia onto institutional websites, and they were providing guidance for institutions about what to do with that. We worked with JISC to provide some guidance that's available on both ours and JISC's website. But what's underpinning that is, you know, when I first heard about it, my reaction was, that seems a lot of effort to go to get 200, 300 quid from a student to write an essay. But what JISC said was that actually now you're getting into organised crime, because what the essay mills that do this are doing, the student will think that they're dealing with a, you know, if it's on your institution website, it's been somehow endorsed, it's okay, this isn't one of the problem ones. But they also are much more willing and likely to give away their personal and financial details, which will then be sold on the dark web. That's what JISC tell me. So this is the sort of message that students need to understand, and that's going to be helped by the fact that these are now criminal entities. I'm going to mention briefly, because I always do, our guidance on essay mills and contract cheating. If you've heard me speak before, I've talked about this before. I'm just going to run through it again. It's covering a lot of ground that we've just had a discussion about, but it was second edition. We undertook off the first edition a survey of UK higher education institutions. We had input from sector experts, including Irene and Robin and other members of the Academic Integrity Advisory Group, importantly input from students as well. It's written for the UK sector, but a lot of the content is applicable globally. The areas cover things that we've just been talking about: education and training for staff, education and support for students, reducing opportunities to cheat, detection, obviously we're in a Turnitin discussion, and then the regulations and policies that are applied. I'm just going to pick up on some of the key findings and recommendations. I'll just brush through these. We've talked about this. Very effective marketing. We're hearing about increases of practice such as blackmail and extortion. Probably the most important thing, every institution needs a Robin and an Irene. I mean, in every respect, they need those, but particularly in that to give the strategic lead for responsibility for staff training, institutional coordination, and to help improve the detection of essay mill use. If that's not viable at with an individual, it should be something, a shared responsibility, ideally with someone from the senior leadership within the institution taking responsibility. But this is what the survey showed. There's, you know, you'll often get pockets within an institution of good practice, but often that's not institution-wide because no one's leading on this. We've talked about this assessment design can help reduce opportunities to cheat. In the first edition of the guidance, it was said we used the word prevention. We got rid of the word prevention because, as Irene said, you can, and both Irene and Robin have said, you can, if someone's determined to cheat, they will, and you cannot design out of assessment. You can't design academic misconduct out of assessment, but you can make it much more difficult by some of the practices that Robin and Irene were talking about, including things such as authentic assessment. Technology can help you detect the use of essay mills, but there's research in the guidance from Australia that shows that that's much more effective when used by experienced staff with knowledge of the student as well, which kind of, you know, we were talking about anonymized assessments that would make that rather problematic. The importance of institutional and peer support. Yes, some students will always intend to cheat. There will be some. The vast majority don't. We believe, and there's, you know, I think there's evidence to support this, it's vulnerable students who are more likely to cheat. They didn't turn up with the intention of cheating, but that's why that peer support is also particularly important. And then this might be stating the obvious, but it still came out. It's something that really would be important to state. Staff and students should be aware of or able to access information and procedures to follow to report suspicions of academic misconduct. Again, briefly, because I'm always going to give this a plug, the Academic Integrity Charter. Hopefully your institution is signed up to the Charter. If it is not, please do so. We've got 195 so far, almost over the 200 mark. What it's really about is trying to take, it's often, we speak about academic, it's always a negative thing about the sector being done to, but this is a positive. It's about promoting academic integrity. It's using a lot of the principles and language that's used in the guidance, but about the proactive actions that you can take if you sign up at institutional level, and it's the commitment that you make towards ensuring your institutional academic integrity. So the 7 principles in it, I'm not going to talk through them, but they basically they cover material that's in the guidance, putting it in those positive terms. I'm just going to mention very briefly some of the work that we've done for our members. Just to go a bit more detail in some of the work, some areas, particularly some. There are other things. I just picked this one. These are about penalties for academic misconduct. This is a bit more in depth. It's developing on some of the work in the guidance, but we undertook interviews with 31 QAA members across the UK and did a quantitative online survey, which got 73 responses. It showed that even though we're always talking about contract cheating because that's the third party stuff, realistically plagiarism, collusion and contract cheating in that order are the most common forms of academic misconduct. That, again, we've touched on this, there's a real wide variation in approach from at an institutional level, from being really supportive, potentially even overly supportive, to being extremely punitive. And there is not, and as with so many things in life, probably the best place to be is somewhere between those two, but probably with greater emphasis on the supportive than the punitive. Some of the findings in this, that providers, very positive providers, are really keen to share best practice. I'll talk about that in relation to the charter update soon. The benefit of empowering students, giving your student body responsibility for academic integrity, and there's a lot of evidence to show that there's a real pride that's taken from students, and in they do not want to cheat, and they don't want their colleagues to cheat, because that is undermining the value of their own work and their own qualifications. The importance of balancing consistency with neutrality, so that during academic misconduct cases, that there is the consistency of having somebody who is present throughout, if it goes through several stages, but also to ensure there's an element of neutrality, somebody who doesn't have any involvement in this. I'm sure all your institutions do this sort of thing. And then also, the benefits of monitoring data so that you can know where to target resources and attention. There was a concern that came through in this research that there seems to be very commonly an overrepresentation of BME students in academic misconduct cases, and that's something that you should be looking at an institutional level and wondering if there is a reason that sits behind that. So I'm just going to finish off with a few things, stuff that we and others are doing. Going back to the legislation, as I've said, it's England only. There was, and we've been talking with devolved administrations, and there was kind of a hope that when the legislation was introduced in England, that there would be legislative consent motions introduced in the devolved, well, certainly in Wales and Scotland, because when it was introduced, there wasn't time to do that. It wasn't possible to introduce legislative consent motions. We're still going to be hopefully working with the devolved administrations so that pretty much a copy of paste on what's happened in England can be introduced to go through the respective nations' legislatures. How will it be enforced? The first prosecution is critical. That goes back to the point I was making about this is for the CPS and police. Surprisingly enough, individual police forces, this might not be at the top of their agenda. What we are planning to do when the legislation comes into force is to speak to the CPS about how they might look to use the legislation to maybe make some suggestions as to the type of body they might wish to use it against, because what would be a bit of a disaster is if there was a prosecution and it failed. New marketing campaign, I've spoken about this. These are now criminal entities, so we're going to revisit that. How to measure the impact of the legislation. As I think I've indicated, there aren't going to be many prosecutions. So how do you work out how effective it's been? We're talking with the DfE about some of that soft stuff I was talking about earlier, about where the impact that has on relations with students understanding now if they're engaging with criminal entities. Difficult to measure over a short time period, but still important to show that their efficacy. And Textra have been doing a lot of work in this area, so we'll be talking to Textra about how they've been doing that, although they do have a fully funded academic integrity unit. We want to assess the impact of the Academic Integrity Charter. As I say, it's voluntary. You don't have to sign up to it. We want you to sign up to it. we don't audit, but we thought it would be useful to do a survey of signatories to say, how have you embedded this into your institutional practice? Particularly, what's some of the good practice that you've introduced as a consequence? Does it work? Are there things that you would change about it? Then we can share that with so that people can, some of the sector-wide activity to be able to share some of that good practice to make sure that this is embedded across your institutions. Going back to the guidance that I was talking about, where I said there was a real disparity between institutional approaches, we're looking at whether or not we can produce some further guidance to make recommendations as to how this can work at institutional level, so that, understanding, for example, that a lot of the contract cheating, essay mill marketing, it's aimed at secondary students. There'll be learned behaviors. They may well have been using essay mills for several years by the time they start. They might not even realize, the full consequences of doing so. So, that's one end of the spectrum. At the other end, there's the serial cheater who is always going to try and cheat their way through. But on an institutional level, it's not catastrophizing the first, but making sure that the second is being dealt with effectively. Looking at a lexicon of terminology, this is an idea that came through the Academic Integrity Advisory Group, which is kind of looking at what common language can be used. QQI and Ireland have done some work in this. And then just mentioning at the end, the UK Academic Integrity Advisory Group, which we kind of, with the legislation passing, this was a big thing that the group was pushing for. Now it's coming to force what the group can do to embed some of the things that we're talking about, and also to mention, this just not happened in the UK, and we do a lot of international work as well. But I chair an ENQA working group on academic integrity, because this has been identified by European quality assurance agencies from the European higher education area as a priority across ENQA members. And I just finished by saying that, Australia's streets ahead of everyone else. Then on a European level, UK and Ireland are considered to be doing pretty well. We've identified this. We're sector-wide taking action. It might not feel sometimes like the case, but when you compare with a lot of countries within the European higher education area, this isn't still even really registering as an issue. So what we want to do with the ENQA working group is kind of really just provide support to quality assurance agencies, whatever level they're at. So I will stop there, because I've said quite a lot, and hand back. I'll stop sharing my screen as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth. That was super interesting and really insightful. So thank you for that. So now I'd like to move into our sort of Q&A. Nicola, are you able to kind of read some questions out that we've had in the chat and put them to the panel, please?
Yeah, so we've got a question. Is it possible to initiate the discussion that makes students start searching for these services if they have not heard about them?
Robin, Irene, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll come in here. Yeah, there's always a danger with this, isn't it? It's like with drugs education, isn't it? Where, if you start to talk to children about drugs, I didn't know about that. That sounds exciting. There's always a danger that will happen. So it needs to be managed very carefully. But that isn't a reason not to do it. I think it's really important that you alert students to it, because if they haven't heard of it before, they will start to hear about it as soon as they become a student, because the students are bombarded with stuff on social media. I don't think any student will avoid hearing about it. I've never come across a student who doesn't know what it is once you've described it to them. They might not know the term contract cheating, they might call it something else, but they know what you're talking about once you start to explain what it's about. So that is no reason why you shouldn't do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the students who are not involved in contract cheating refer to it by rather more pejorative and blunt names than contract cheating. Their views on it are unrepeatable here. But even if you get a student who's gone all the way through secondary school and not become aware of it. As soon as somebody gets wind that they're off to a university, maybe because they've put it on their social media, maybe because one of their mates has put it on the social media and things, they will be bombarded. And that could be several months before they actually join that university. So, you know, there is absolutely no reason not to do it and every reason to do it.
I can see a question here as well. What methods, approaches can we employ to gain support from those higher up than us? There appears to be a little incentive for universities to admit there's even a problem, as this makes them look bad.
Right. Well, in my case, it was focusing Senate's thoughts on the fact that they had to consider taking a degree away, kind of clinched it.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know Gareth's view on this, but certainly in my own case, I'm still trying very hard to get the top management on board with this. They're not uninterested in it, but they don't see it as their top priority. Yeah. And quite often I will find that that the kind of academic integrity has been missed off things, and I have to go and remind them to put it back in there. So, for example, I've recently been doing some work just looking at where the boundaries are of academic integrity policies, and basically every single operation within a university has some dimension of integrity in it. And one of the areas we frequently forget about is admissions. You know, it's really very important that because anything that involves quality involves integrity. So if there's a quality dimension to it, there has to be an integrity dimension to it as well. We might not call it academic integrity, it might be research integrity, it might be ethics, it might be something else. But you know, even staff recruitment, staff training, all of those kind of things, everything involves some dimension of integrity. So the university needs to see it as a holistic requirement for every kind of operational area of the university. And I'm still trying very hard to persuade everybody of the seriousness of, particularly the seriousness of contract cheating, and the fact that it's important to put necessary resources behind all the initiatives that we have.
We've got a question for you now, Gareth, as well. Does the QAA or any other body have the means to require the institutions that are less committed to resourcing academic integrity to do so?
QAA doesn't. We're an independent charity. We're not a regulator. So although we do have different functions in different nations, I mean, that is actually, I'm going to rewind slightly, because I was going to come in at the end of the previous question, just on the, you know, what can be done, what can be done to make those at the top pay attention. I mean, I think it's a bit of a shame to hear that, because, and I work at an institution, I think going back to 2019, I think it was, a load of VCs, I think 42 VCs wrote to, it wasn't organised by us, it was, they wrote to the then Secretary of State to say, we're really worried about this impact that this is having on our institution. We demand that action is taken to introduce legislation. In fact, a lot of people thought we'd arranged that, and a lot of people said to a lot of VCs in our discussions, said, oh, I wasn't asked to sign up to that, and I would have done if I'd been asked. So I'm slightly concerned to see what seems to be a kind of, you know, a very positive move in direction at the highest level of institutions isn't actually being carried out, isn't being seen through in a kind of day-to-day, implementing at a governance level. I think it's interesting in England, and I think it's also positive that the Office for Students, who are the regulator, have started introducing legislation, have started introducing academic integrity increasingly within their own regulatory framework. Now, in terms of they take a sort of risk-based compliance approach at the Office for Students, so it's only going to likely result in regulatory action if you're within the Office for Students zone of failing to meet with their requirements for registration. But it should feed in, the more it's used in language of regulatory compliance, the more that should start filtering in, whether or not you have a compliance issue yourself, in terms of what you need to do, what your checklist is to make sure that you're staying on the right side. I think that's increasingly happening in Wales and Scotland as well. And I think it's one of the benefits of how involving regulators and governments in the Academic Integrity Advisory Group. I've now entirely forgotten what the question that I got asked was. Sorry.
It was around, are you able to, force institutions to, deal with academic integrity more as part of the QAA?
No, we're not. That's not our role. There is an expectation, if you sign up to the charter, which I'll say again, if you haven't signed up to the charter, please do, that is a commitment to embedding academic integrity into all elements of your institutional practice. But we can't audit against that. So, but it is for regulators. And as I said, that's kind of why I connected the two, because regulators are increasingly looking at this as something that they want to apply the stick as well as the more carrot-based approach that we have.
Yeah, thank you. Robin?
Yeah, I think part of the issue with support from higher up institutions might be that many of the senior people in institutions are 5, 10 or more years away from the chalk face, so to speak. And it's over that sort of period that contract cheating and cheap offshore essay mills have really become the problem they currently are. So I think there's possibly just a level of disconnectedness with how fast this problem has shifted and how prevalent it's become in a comparatively short period.
Maybe there's a job to be done there with the senior leadership in raising awareness and making them aware of how everything has developed in the last few years. And I don't think it's not that, too negatives, it's not that they're not concerned. It's just that they have other priorities and they don't always think about integrity first. They think about integrity as a big risk, lack of integrity. And contract cheating is one manifestation of that. But they have other priorities, particularly recently. They've had other things to worry about and spend money on. And not having a lot of money is a big issue as well.
We have another question. Do you think disciplinary action should vary with the course that the student is taking? So, for example, if an arts student is caught, then remedial action may be appropriate. If it's a medical or a veterinary student who's caught, then if you can't trust them around essay writing, how will they behave when they have access to strong drugs or vulnerable patients? What are your thoughts there on the level of disciplinary action? In my view, it doesn't matter which course they're on, which subject they're studying, or even which level they're on. Because in fact, we deliberately didn't introduce, when we designed our penalties or outcomes, as we now call them more positively, we didn't distinguish between postgraduate taught students and undergraduate students in terms of the penalties. I know some institutions do, but we didn't do that. And that is because postgraduate taught students, a lot of them are international students, even students who are UK-based students might have been out of education for quite a long time. Therefore, they're coming in with a similar kind of disadvantages as undergraduate students. They haven't studied in UK higher education before or recently. They're coming in with potentially with a very similar kind of mindset. And so we don't distinguish between that. And we certainly don't distinguish between subjects. We do find that in art subjects, we seem to get less cheating cases generally, less misconduct cases, academic misconduct cases generally than in, say, business and law. But of course, the other issue there to do with the subject is that in some subjects there are professional registration consequences as well with cheating that in addition to whatever penalty is added at the institution level, that they may find themselves unable to register.
Yeah, just picking up from that point, with courses where there are professional accreditations, whether legal or medical or other subjects I can't immediately bring to mind. There are the allied questions of fitness to practice. If there's been an integrity failure of some sort, does the student have the fitness to practice? And one thing as a sector we really need to do is to make sure that the professional institutions who accredit courses are aware of the nature and the scale of the problem. Because sometimes I get a sense that they're still thinking about, you know, what the problem was like 10, 20 or more years ago, simply because of the phenomenal speed at which it's become the problem it currently is.
I was just going to mention some very quick point, which is just say talking about professional, about professional postgraduates, bodies and qualifications, etc. We always describe this as a societal issue, not a higher education issue, because if you have graduates who are going into professional life who have not had the skills, the education, the ability to work in a professional environment, that has societal implications. So, you know, it's really important to, when messaging about this, not to just make it feel like it's just a thing about education.
Yeah, I mean, would you want to engage a solicitor to do your conveyancing when you're moving house, who actually paid somebody else to pass their conveyancing exams? You know,
You want to drive
the level of problem potentially going forward, or go and be prescribed by a medic who cheated their drug dose calculations, or drive a car where the person who designed the airbags cheated that particular part of their engineering qualification. You know, we can pick endless examples here, but there is that real potential for societal impacts, to some of which could literally be fatal.
So we have a question from Matthew Jones for Gareth. What advice do you have regarding the standard of proof required for conviction? In my experience, those that sit on an academic misconduct panel want to see the metaphorical smoking gun, which is almost impossible with contract cheating, but we can identify lots of red flags that are indicative of contract cheating.
Yeah, I mean, in the guidance, the balance of proof, we recommend a balance of probability, because the criminal standard of proof, there's a reason why it's the criminal standard of proof, and why it's so high, because criminal law is different from most other entities. It's virtually impossible to prove to beyond doubt. So yeah, I mean, that's our advice. Of course, institutions are free to determine how they want to do that, but I think that's really the only realistic way that you have of ensuring a fair outcome.
Yeah,
but also there is a need to train the panelists what balance of probabilities mean, because I think the questioner is absolutely right. We have the same problem in my institution, where sometimes the panel members expect the smoking gun, even though they know it's balance of probabilities. So kind of educating them what that means and why it's important, that you can't expect. The only way you're going to get 100% proof is if the student confesses what they've done, and that does happen sometimes. It can be, you know, we can torture it out of them, but no, I didn't mean that. But you know, it does happen sometimes if the student really has remorse. That's one of the things we talked about, Robin, isn't it, in the work that we've done on the kind of when a student wants to be honest about what they've done. Yeah, so I think training the panel members and making them more aware of what actually is meant by balance of probabilities is an important factor.
Yeah, and one point I'd make is quite often there is a smoking gun there, but you as the investigator have to make sure that it is written down in black and white. You cannot leave it to the panel's imagination or the student's verbal dexterity in a hearing to try and explain away stuff. You've got to hit the panel with the full blunt force of the evidence you've uncovered. It doesn't always work, but it's the best you can do, and it can take time.
Thank you. A bit of a controversial question coming up for you now. Anybody's free to answer. Whoever wants to take it. Are there universities who you believe are turning a blind eye to contract cheating?
I think there are universities, certainly, I think there are universities in the UK that are in denial. I'm not prepared to name any. And in fact, I don't necessarily know, because we haven't done any surveys recently. Yeah. Certainly going back a few years, I could name some, but I'm not going to. It wouldn't be right. But I suspect there are still some universities who are doing less than they could do to about this problem, in terms of having holistic policies, for one thing, and making sure that the outcomes for every student will be the same or equivalent, but also in terms of alerting staff and students to the problem. I think there are some institutions that should do more. So if your institution is one of those, it would be interesting to find out and to help you, really, and to guide you. I don't know how we do that, how we track those down. Perhaps we ought to have another UK-wide survey to find out what's going on in different institutions. But the problem is with surveys is you tend to you tend to preach to the converted. You know, so the audience of this webinar is likely to be people who are already doing the good things. Yeah. And the ones that are less engaged are less likely to engage in webinars like this. So if your institution is one that isn't taking it seriously, contact us. We'd like to talk to you, see if we can help you. I don't know any other way to do it, but it would be interesting to do a survey. But getting honest answers from everybody is difficult, because it's one of these kind of questions. It's slightly incriminating, isn't it? If you tell us your institution isn't doing it.
It's almost a leading question.
Yeah, absolutely.
But personally, I am not aware of any in the UK. But the people who contact me, and quite a lot of people at other universities do contact me one way and another, are those who are already aware of the problem and have been for a while and have come up with some weird knotty problem, or they're those who are relatively recently discovered the scale of the problem that they didn't think they had and are contacting in something of a hurry to try and get up to speed very quickly. So I'm interested. I think the things to look out for would be any university that is foolish enough to advertise, we don't have a contract cheating problem.
Absolutely.
Because that is almost certainly a university that is saying we have a really big contract cheating problem.
Gareth, I'd be interested in what you found out from your work in chairing the ENQA group. That's what I wanted to talk to you about after the webinar, actually, your work with the ENQA group, and what you know about Europe, because certainly my earlier research, sort of 10 years ago in Europe, revealed very, very little activity in most European countries in terms of integrity. And I think it's moving. I think the landscape and the awareness is moving in quite a lot of countries in Europe.
Yeah, I think to be slightly positive about it, although it's being positive about something that's overall pretty negative, is that the UK seems to be, while acknowledging that there are probably institutions in denial, overall there seems to be a far greater acceptance of this as being a significant issue affecting every higher education institution than is the case in other jurisdictions, where some of the ENQA members are basically saying that the sector's in denial. It's just well, and I think there's a couple of other things I'd say about that. Firstly, I think that's changed over the last few years as well. I think there is. I've been working in higher education now since I came to QIA in 2016, and I think the feeling very, very much there was that if there was an acknowledgement of an issue, it was yes, it is an issue, but them, not us. Whatever you think about categorizing institutions into where they sit on the quality scale according to which mission group they belong to, there maybe was a tendency amongst certain mission groups to think that it was a bit of an issue in other areas of provision, which I think has changed a lot. I think that certainly we don't, it feels that when, again, it might be slightly self-electing, but I think every institution we speak to acknowledges now that there is an issue. But you can see why the temptation is to not dig too deep, because of the sort of Pandora's box that lies therein, in that, if you have institution X and institution Y, and institution X has data which shows the case of academic misconduct like that, and institution Y like that, then looking from the outside, you might say, well, they've got a real problem at institution X, but in fact, it might just be institution X take it seriously, and institution Y just going la 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 la. That's, you can see why some people might not want to delve too deeply.
Thank you very much. Nicola, over to you.
Yeah, so we've got Claudine who's raised her hand to talk for a little while now. So Claudine, if you'd like to come off mute and to pose your question.
It's just a quick question. I mean, this is very interesting because I'm one of the academic integrity officers for my university, and dealing mainly with foundation students, and the university is actually widening participation, which is actually even worse. Kind of the support that we need to be providing, I think, is actually key to bring in the confidence for students actually to be less likely to use ghostwriters. But I've sort of posed some few questions around blockchain, because I think, so technically that's my area of interest. I think actually there's an opportunity where blockchain can be used, where actually universities may have their own blockchain, where students actually have to, have a way of actually using blockchain as an option. So I'm thinking, what are the tools technically that are available that possibly could be used and embedded within assessments that will actually help universities really bypass this? I mean, this is a huge problem. It's not going to go away, we know, but we have to find a way of doing. So, sorry, I've sort of rattled on.
Yeah, but given that, I think we're all aware of some students who give their current IT access to ghostwriters, so that ghostwriters can go in and get the learning materials and the book lists and things without going through the student. What's to stop a student giving their institutional blockchain access to a ghostwriter so that the boxes get ticked all the way through and you get what looks like a good coherent evidence trail?
I'd be quite interested to go back to the person who asked the question. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Apologies. Would you have any idea about how that might be used and why that might be an advantage? Because as Robin says, that it's all about security, and students who resort to using SA mills don't seem to care about security at all.
No.
If it's possible to just quickly explain, blockchain really monitors everything. It's not really as simple as you've just sort of hinted there, Robin. It is actually a tool that can be used to capture quite a lot of things. You can start off, identification of IP address. There are lots of things that you can actually sort of start to actually embed and see if there's a pattern. So it really is a tool that can be used, and I'd like to disagree with Robin.
Well, I shall be interested to see the evidence coming out of any pilot study. But it's easy to fake IP addresses. And if institutions do start using blockchain and other things I'm not aware of that are broadly similar, SA mills will find a way to work around it and with it and within it, because we're seeing it, at every time we try to do something, the SA mills catch up very quickly.
Thank you, Claudine. Really interesting question.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Going back to the Q&A, in terms of rehabilitation for the student, what does that actually mean, and how do you determine whether that has been successful? Is this simply not cheating, or is this, and how does one test that in the case of contract cheating?
Right, so as I kind of raise this, I'll pick this one up. What we do is we have our Centre for Academic Writing and the library run regular tutorials or workshops for students. They're not just for students coming through academic conduct, they're available for any student. And so the student is required to sign up on one of these, on the most appropriate one. There are a whole range of them. But the one that was designated specifically for the academic conduct one was one on academic integrity. So they run, and we've been doing this for about 18 months now. So we haven't actually evaluated this yet, but we hopefully will find time to do that. If the student, we say that it's a compulsory attendance at this session. The student has to register themselves because they're not marked as being academic conduct students. It could be any student. There's no judgmental side to it. They're just attending as a student attendee of a tutorial. I think that's really quite important. And the people running the webinar, running the kind of workshop, they have all been online, but there is no need for them to be in perpetuity. The people running it do not report back, so we have no way of actually checking and making it compulsory. If a student chooses not to attend, then they choose not to attend. We are looking for ways to kind of enforce the mandatory nature of it, but it's not possible to do that at the moment. But what we can do, the tutor can actually go back and check whether the student did attend, so we can find out that way around. If the student comes back into the academic conduct system, they are then referred to a tutor, and there is a conversation with the tutor about whether they did attend, whether they attended and didn't engage, if there's anything else that's causing the problem. And so that's the nature of the kind of educational side of it. They can be then referred to a different workshop or for a one-to-one, depending on the nature of whatever the student did. If the student even then chooses not to engage with that, they will inevitably come back into the system again. And eventually 3 strikes and you're out, more or less. It's not quite as simple as that, but the student will end up getting expelled. We can't convert everybody, and we can't, it doesn't work for everybody, but certainly the students that I have spoken to, because I've been referred to some students have been referred to me personally, they have been really remorseful and really, really kind of communicative about what they've done. And I've got no doubt that it had a positive effect on them. But we haven't done an overall evaluation of it, but it's something I do intend to do. In terms of checking whether it's working or not, we're not very good at collecting statistics. We never have been, and I'm trying to improve that now that I'm in this role. I'm trying to actually improve the quality of the statistics that we keep so that we can monitor what's going on and have a much more detailed breakdown of the cases that are coming forward, and also repeat offences and so on. So I haven't got historical data to the degree of detail that I would like, but we'll continue to do that and continue to improve on that sort of from next year onwards, and then and continue to monitor it, and that's presumably how we're going to find out.
The other questions, a couple are quite related. So can universities punish ghostwriters instead? If so, how? And then a similar question, who do we report to when we find a UK essay mill?
Well, I mean, at the moment, we have no legal recourse to punish a ghostwriter. Until that act is signed, until that bill is signed and becomes an act, it is perfectly legal to ghostwrite. I'm guessing, Gareth, that when it does become an act, will it be reporting to JISC? Reporting to JISC?
No, I mean, this is what I was saying earlier on. This is freestanding legislation. It's the CPS who would decide on any prosecutions. As I said earlier at the start, I doubt they would. I mean, there are the two for various sort of reasons why the tests you have to pass in order to bring a prosecution, one is which is the interest of justice test. Any attention is more likely to be focused on companies than individual ghostwriters. Rightly so, I have to say. In terms of the where can you find an essay mill, I think where it's probably easier to avoid essay. Sorry, my phone. Sorry. That's they're not difficult to find, and if you and about reporting them, well, you know, I posted it's a link in my first slide which shows you exactly where 1070 are, and that's only a small number. It's I mean, yes, sorry, going back to what Robin was saying, make JISC aware of essay mill sites, not prosecutions. Yes. Sorry, my brain is now caught up with my mouth. Yes, JISC should be aware of essay mill sites, yes, because they can add them to the Janet network. And that's said when they when this becomes legislation, they're going to ban all identified essay mills from the Janet network. And apologies to Robin, I totally misunderstood what you said there. Sorry.
No, too busy Googling essay mills.
So we've got another question here. I'm wary of time. I'm trying to get through as many questions as possible because there's some good ones here. But one for you here, Gareth, asking for your view. With the new achievement and progression targets, most lecturers will ignore contract cheating as they have to meet their targets. What's your view on this?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of underlines a more significant issue, which I think we reflect in our guidance, is that, you know, overstretched staff who have all sorts of targets to meet, all sorts of pressure on delivery. It takes time, effort, and resource to investigate, and it's no use expecting individual academics to take action if they have a suspicion, unless they feel supported institutionally and be given the time, the space, and the support to be able to investigate. Because if they think there's any either in terms of resource or any other reason why there'd be a disincentive, then it'd be very easy to see why they wouldn't. So I think that's a good point, well made, but it relates across the board to individual academics in feeling supported to be able to take action if they have a suspicion.
So if I can just add to what Gareth said, ideally there should be support for academic staff, but also it would be useful if the efforts of academic staff in dealing with these cases was in some way rewarded rather than seen as a kind of negative. We're not doing that yet, but I quite like that idea of the fact that in some way it's acknowledged the fact that staff are following up on these cases and helping to increase integrity.
Yes.
Is there guidance or advice from the QAA or elsewhere on what the balance of probability means in practice, or is it up to the institution to train to their own standards?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I mean, it's mentioned in our guidance. As I mentioned as well, we want to do some more. We want to do a bit more work in this area, but ultimately, independent institutions who have their own policies and procedures, we're not. The balance of probabilities is a legal concept. It's more likely that something happened than it isn't. It's not difficult to comprehend, but at an institutional level, there's going to be a wide variation of what that might mean. So there's nothing that we really have at present other than to advise that, but we are conscious that it's something that kind of greater level of advice on how that might be interpreted in terms of the way your policies and procedures put in place could be helpful, which I know is not a particularly useful answer, but it kind of, there's so many areas where you can kind of go, yes, that would be a bit more helpful. I think, I mean, I don't work in an institution and I'm not an academic, but I think that there may be an element of, as soon as you're dealing with kind of legalistic concepts like balance of probability and beyond doubt, it can be a bit scary. As to, unless you get it absolutely strictly correct, then you're going to be sued or something like that. You're not in a court. You know, it is applying a legal concept, but within the context of your own institutional practices. So whatever that means for your institution, as I said, to say something's more likely to have happened than not likely to have happened, you don't need to be a QC to understand that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And just one final question, because I'm aware of the time. Are there any implications of JISC blocking essay mills in making it harder for staff to gather evidence if the staff can't access these sites?
That's probably a question to ask JISC. I don't know how the Janet network works like that. I don't know what kind of, I don't know, you know, I think I'm happy to raise that with JISC as an issue that because they told us that they would be able to block on their Janet network, and I didn't really kind of dig any deeper than that other than say, oh, that's good. So yeah, I will happy raise that with JISC and then feed back to Deborah to say what they unless of course Irene and Robin know more than I do.
No, I'm not going to answer the question. I was just thinking, I was just wondering myself what it actually means to block essay mills.
Yeah.
Block them in what way? You know.
It's kind of meaningless. I mean, a JISC block would keep them off Janet, but a member of staff wanting to check something out, their home network wouldn't be blocked on a day they're working from home or an afternoon they're working from home, and their mobile network wouldn't be blocked if they wanted to use their phone or their iPad or their Android tablet or something and use 4G or 5G mobile networks. I mean, you know, that's the whole problem with blocking, and why I think it's a misuse of resource is because it's so easy to work around.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's not going to stop the students using their own networks. But you know, every little helps.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That's what I think. I think it's a combination of things that just help to lots of small things help.
Well, with a couple of minutes to go, I'd like to really thank you all for taking the time to join us today, Gareth, Robin and Irene. It's been fascinating speaking to you and having this discussion and you sharing your insight from your experience and also your institutions as well. So,
can I just thank all the attendees, all the participants, because there's been some fantastic chat stuff going on.
Yeah.
I haven't had time to read it all, but I'm trying to concentrate on the questions. Fantastic stuff in the so thank you to all the audience as well.
Yeah,
Deborah, there is Dr. Mike Reddy who says his is the only question we never answered. From the Q&A, so he's hoping we'll answer it now, if possible.
Okay.
What is it?
Sorry. What was your question? Do you want to unmute yourself, Dr. Reddy? If you're still here. Yeah, I think it's coming up.
And I've allowed you to talk.
Hi,
Mike,
can
if
you
you
hear me?
want to.
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, it's just really in answer to a kind of point that Irene raised earlier. My PhD student and I have been having real problems getting ethical approval to talk to students, because when we go, they go, but if a student declares to you that they've engaged in misconduct or whatever, you have to report it.
We had a research project like that we did with Australia, and the way we got round it is, and I thought I'd talk to you about this, Mike. The way we got round it is to get the Students' Union to do the interviewing.
Yeah, we've been trying that, but so far we've even had that blocked as well.
Yeah, well, I would, yeah. That's the only thing I can suggest. It needs to be somebody who's able to be independent of the university and able to be to put that confidence in and to do the anonymizing before it's sent to the university. And that we got permission to do it that way, and so did Deakin University by having Students' Union do it.
I'll keep digging then. Thank you.
Yeah, I would do that.
Well, thank you, Mike. We've got lots of questions still unanswered. We'll have a look at the chat transcript after this call and try and get back to you with as many answers to your questions. I second what Irene says. Thank you so much for your input today. And thank you for taking the time to attend this. And as ever, to our panel, thank you so much for sharing your insight. And I hope you have a nice Easter, everybody. So thank you for attending.
COVID-free, hopefully.
Yes. Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.